Okay, chapter 6 is on evolution and ecology. So we'll go over some of the driving factors in evolution and how that relates to ecology. Key concepts for this chapter are: evolution is viewed as genetic change over time or a process of descent with modification. Natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow can cause allele frequencies in populations to change over time. And natural selection is the mechanism for adaptive evolution. Long-term patterns are shaped by large-scale processes such as speciation, mass extinction, and adaptive radiation. Ecological interactions in evolution exert profound influence on one another. There's this example, I'll give another one here, of bighorn sheep populations changing over time. And they say there's been a reduction of 90% of the bighorn sheep populations, which is due largely due to habitat loss, introduction of cattle. And they give an example of hunting as selective pressure, where trophy hunting removes the largest and strongest males, the ones that would sire the many healthy offspring, and the average size of males and their horns have decreased over 30 years. And there's a couple, I think, confounding factors here that they don't necessarily address. One is this loss due to habitat loss, this overall population decrease. But also, as the book mentions, that sometimes, and it's rare, but sometimes these tags, which is the hunting permit to harvest one of these animals, can go for $100,000. That's typically what's called a governor's tag, and those are auctioned off by the State Fish and Wildlife Office to generate money for to fund their programs for habitat and species protection. But generally, hunting bighorn sheep is very expensive. In the state of Washington, you can hunt mountain goats, and I think bighorn sheep as well in eastern Washington. But like, you can hunt mountain goats at Mount Baker. However, to get a tag, you have to enter a raffle, which I don't recall. I think it's the standard tag raffle fee, which is $6, and on average, I think it takes, if you don't get drawn, you earn a point. On average, I think it's about 25 points to win a tag. So you basically have to put $6 in the pot for, on average, 25 years. And at the end of that, you would draw a tag. And then to buy the tag is another, I believe, $1,600. So it's quite expensive. And states regulate hunting for certain characteristics. And so bighorn sheep is typically, depending on the state, it's the size of this curl, or there's annuli you can see. Like, there's an annuli here, there's one here. I'm not good at reading bighorn sheep annuli. So they typically say you have to have a curl that goes either below the eye or has started to curl upward, or have a certain number of annuli. Other areas, you can take nannies, females, or you can take smaller males. So the state can really regulate what animals are taken. And to a certain extent, the hunting pressure would have to be pretty extreme to see this sort of change, which can happen. And I'll give another example as well. But when something like a mountain goat is the most mature, frequently they only have a year or two left to live, because when they're sort of king of the hill, that's very energetic. It costs a lot of energy to fight off all the other males. And so instead of eating, they're frequently sparring. And so there's often a large natural mortality as well. But these data are showing a decrease in the average weight, which is an important factor, and corresponding average horn length. Now, to really understand that, you would also need age as well, because you could have still the same gene pool, just animals aren't living as long, and that would not be necessarily a genetic modification. Now, if these individuals were all the same age, then that's a larger concern, and so without the age structure, it's a bit hard to tease apart. But this selection impact of harvest is profound, right? Like, harvest is killing. And so if we introduced a fair amount of additional harvest, that can genetically modify populations over time. And in fisheries, this has been one way that people are trying to reduce the genetic impact of the natural selection impact on fisheries is what's called ecosystem-based fisheries management, EBFM. And so it's looking at how gear efficiency and types of gear can alter the genetic structure of fish, as well as maintaining overall ecosystem health. So the argument is, in our fisheries models, we need to incorporate, in our fisheries management, we need to incorporate the ecosystem services of those fish, meaning we can say, for a Chinook run, a king salmon run, we can harvest X number of fish and have a sustainable population, but we also need to include into the harvest quotient how much are needed for other things like orca whales. And so this is one way of thinking about it. And one way that salmon fishing in particular can alter populations is frequently the way that salmon populations are managed is by what's called escapement. So particularly in Alaska, they have really good fisheries management, and they've got typically weirs or some way of counting fish, salmon, as they return to the stream. And they say this river has an escapement goal of 100,000 fish. And so what can happen is they'll open up fishing maybe a bit early in the season, and then depending on what the escapement looks like, they'll close fishing. When they hit escapement, their 100,000 fish they need for that river, then they'll open up fishing and say, like, go at it, go wild. So what that means is the fish that return later have a much higher percentage of being caught. If you're the 120,000th fish to return in a stream that only needs 100,000 fish, per the models, you're going to get caught. Where if you're the 90,000th fish to return, you're more likely to make it through and not get caught. What these data show here are two things. One, the open circles are the percentage of being likelihood of being caught, and the black is the escapement, meaning the fish that make it through. And so what we see here these are Julian days. So January 1 is 2, January 2 is 2, etc., all the way through the year. We've got data over a long time. Kind of zoom in, and there's the next slide has a couple other graphs as well. But here's an example of opening fishing early, saying, okay, we were expecting a good run. Right here, we've got, if you return on this day, there's a 90% chance that you're going to get caught. They slow fishing down, allow for some escapement, and then open up fishing towards the end. You can kind of follow this and see that the distribution of returning fish has shifted earlier. So fish are starting to return earlier. Here's another example of fishing opening early and then towards the end kind of going up a bit more. The next slides show that a bit more clearly. So looking at particularly this system here where fishing is open in small amounts until the escapement goal is reached, and then fishing pressure greatly increases. And so here we're looking at a 90 to 95% chance of being caught. So of the fish that return after the escapement goal is reached, the vast majority, 90+%, are being caught. Same thing here, reduced fishing pressure until the escapement goals are met, and then generally an increase in fishery efficiency. Here as well, kind of early fishing pressure, escapement, and then less fishing pressure thereafter. And if we look at the mean return date, Oh, I thought I had that slide in here. Okay, let me throw that in. Give me 1 second. Okay, this is the slide I want to see. So this is taking all of those data and looking at it based on median arrival day of year for the salmon fishing district, and then year or time on the X. And what we see is a move to fish returning earlier. So fishing is giving a strong selective pressure that if you're later in the run, you're more likely to get caught. So there's an advantage to being earlier in the run. Now, this is important because salmon have a resilient portfolio in the way that they return, meaning they do return over a long period of weeks or a month. And likely, if you're the first one to come and dig your red and spawn, there's a good likelihood that red will be dug up by another fish and replaced. So there's a good likelihood that you might not survive. And then also if your eggs do survive and incubate, they're going to hatch earlier in the year. Salmon eggs hatch on what's called degree days, similar to degree days, which means that incubation is related to temperature. And so if you're the first in, you're the first to hatch. And if your offspring hatch earlier, the environment might not be ready. There might not be enough insects, etc., for the offspring to consume. If you're the last to spawn, you can dig up somebody else's red, put your eggs there, but your offspring might hatch later in the year and not survive. They could be outcompeted. There's already larger Chinook in the stream system that have taken up all the good habitat. But because of stochastic natures of climate and weather, perhaps if you're the first one to spawn, in the spring there could be a big flood event that washes out all of the other eggs, and so therefore the early ones are going to do better. Or it could be a colder year, and so the later ones are actually hatching at the optimal time for insects and things to consume. And all the individuals that hatched earlier hatched in an environment that's not supportive and wound up dying. And so they have this broad return time window to deal with that stochastic nature of the environment. But what we're doing is we're shifting the median arrival time to a narrower window earlier in the season, which is reducing that natural ability for them to deal with stochastic natures in the environment. So it's another example of how humans are altering timing of organisms via harvest. So we have a large impact on the environment, pollution, land use changes, climate change. And we're beginning to start to look at how these impacts not only alter population structures, amounts, distributions, but also have evolutionary consequences. And one, concern there is that these changes can be permanent. If we permanently lose genetic diversity, or we lose genetic diversity, that those changes are likely to be permanent. They're hard to reverse. And so this horn size in bighorn sheep is a heritable trait. So hunting selectively eliminates rams with large horns and favors rams with genes for smaller horns. And so this hunting can likely cause a genetic change over time to where animals now have smaller horns. Again, we need a bit more context for that as far as like age and then the heritability of large horns. In antlered animals, deer, elk, etc., antler size is partially genetic, but it's also a measure of fitness. But those are animals that are growing their antlers every year and dropping them, compared to horned animals, which are maintaining their horns year-round. So genes are made of DNA and specify or encode protein structure. They can have two or more forms called alleles, and so alleles are different forms of genes. The genotype is the genetic makeup of the individual. It's typically represented by letters. So if a gene has two alleles, it'll be the A and lowercase a genotype. So your genotype can be AA, large A, little a, or two little a's. One allele inherited from the mother and one from the father, sort of a biology review here. And evolution is a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. So the frequency of a little a in a population is 40%. The frequency of the large A allele is 60%. If the frequency of little a were to change to 71%, the population would have evolved at that gene. So there would have been an overall genetic evolution or change. So evolution is broadly defined as descent with modification. So you have to have some sort of modification that is heritable to your offspring. As a population accumulates differences over time, new species can form. There's a lot of debate around the species concept. How do we define species? But typically we go through a subspecies speciation before full species speciation. But the new species will have many of the same characteristics as its ancestors and resemble them. So the evolution is slow, that you'll have two closely related species that might look quite similar and behave quite similar, but now have enough modifications that we consider them different species or subspecies. This is that example from sticklebacks, and this is kind of interesting because these are 10 million year old fossils. They were able to date very accurately and look at how quick these sticklebacks were modified, and they were looking at the size of their pelvic bone and looking at this pelvic score is what they call it, but large pelvic bone to small pelvic bone, happening really over the space of 5 to 10,000 years, which is pretty quick in the grand scheme of looking at fossils that are 10 million years old. And that's a pretty rare example where we've got good dating and a good fossil record where we can look at evolution over geological timescales, because these processes, particularly in the absence of strong selection like anthropogenic forces, take a long time. So this is kind of one window of thinking about what's the scale of natural evolution, and 10,000 years, being moving the fish pretty strongly from a higher pelvic score to a much smaller pelvic bone. And so Darwin used the phrase descent with modification when he proposed populations change over time through natural selection. Individuals with certain heritable traits survive and reproduce more successfully than other individuals. We can look at these examples of, and there's another example like of moths, and even our eastern gray squirrels. The black squirrels you might see running around are actually eastern gray squirrels. That typically in the West we tend to have black gray squirrels. But here's an example of a rock pocket mice. And the ones that live in dark larval formations have dark coats, where nearby populations that live in light-colored rocks have lighter coats. This is an adaptation to being consumed by visual predators. You can imagine birds of prey, etc., swooping down and eating these little guys. And so if they're able to have a coat that mimics their substrate, the ground they live on, it's easier for them to hide. If you're a light brown mouse on black lava formations, you're going to get picked off pretty quickly, and vice versa. So that's a pretty strong selection factor. So evolution can act as a sorting process. Individuals with favorable traits have more offspring, and their alleles will increase in frequency of the population. The population will evolve, but individuals do not evolve. And so, meaning it's a intergenerational mechanism. It's not something that happens on one time scale, but it's the having a trait that leads to increased fitness, those offspring carrying that same trait and them having increased fitness, where individuals without that trait have decreased fitness, Fitness is typically defined as the number of offspring you have and how well they do. And natural selection is not the only mechanism of evolutionary change. There's mutation, genetic drift, and gene flow also contribute. We mentioned genotype, which is the actual genetic code, and then phenotype is the observable characteristic influenced by genotype. And so individuals differ from one another in part because they have different alleles of genes that influence phenotype. So genotype is what we measure using molecular techniques. Phenotype is what we see. Here's an example of individuals from a population of these are poison dart frogs, showing variation in color and pattern. So they can be genetically similar but have different phenotypic traits depending on how those genes are expressed. Different alleles arise by mutation. So mutation is generally small, takes a long time. Generally, mutations do not change the overall structure of the alleles or corresponding phenotypes, but they are the sort of raw material for evolution. Mutations can result from copying errors during cell division, mechanical damage, exposure to chemicals, UV, etc. And formation of new alleles is critical to evolution. Without mutation, all members would be this identical. And so without mutation, we're not introducing new alleles. So without mutation, we're just selecting on existing alleles. And that sort of evolution could be happening now, meaning like the bighorn sheep example, there's a wide spectrum of genetic diversity. Hunting's narrowing in on one piece of that genetic diversity and removing that, compared to a more natural system where you could have mutations that are then resulting in some adaptive change that would then be favored. And so here, when we're looking at human mitigated or human assisted evolution, we're primarily removing genetic diversity as opposed to genetic diversity thriving via mutations. And recombination produces different genotypes in the population. So offspring have a combination of alleles that differ from their parents. Mutation provides the raw material on which evolution is based, and recombination rearranges the raw material into new combinations. So again, getting one from the mother, one from each of the parents. Mutations are actually very rare. They typically occur once every 10,000 to a million copies of the gene. So that would be, once every 10,000 to 1 million individuals. And generally, the background mutation rate is a weak agent of allele frequency change, but in some cases, mutation rates are frequent enough to affect allele frequencies, as in the development of antibacterial resistant bacteria. And that's also the part of like a massive selection antibiotics, something that typically has a higher mutation rate and higher much shorter generation time, bacteria versus elephants. And so we can look at three types of natural selection. The first is directional selection, where individuals at one phenotypic extreme, i.e. large or small size, are favored. And this example is in ground finches that during drought favored a large beak size. And so here's pre-drought, where the kind of median beak size is 8.8. And then during a drought, the seeds got larger and harder. And so individuals with larger beaks fared much better. And so after a drought, the average or the median beak size went up to about 1 millimeter. And so this was driven by this short event of drought producing larger, harder seeds. So individuals with small beak sizes couldn't crack those seeds, and as a seed eater, not being able to open seeds is a strong selection impact. And there's stabilizing selection, which is sort of kind of like a Goldilocks hypothesis, where they're not too big, they're not too small, where the intermediate phenotype is favored. An example of this is parasitic wasps select for small gall size of Eurasta flies, while birds select for larger gall size. And so you've got two competing predators that are picking off big ones and little ones, and so the ones in the middle tend to have an advantage. So here's an example of that. So before selection, there's a wider distribution of gall sizes, and after selection, it begins to narrow. And disruptive selection is where individuals at both extremes are favored. An example of this are African seed crackers, which have two food sources: hard seeds that require a large beak to crack, and smaller, softer seeds that require smaller beaks. And so this can be the foundation for divergence for subspecies if this continues and individuals don't, if the population is not well mixed, meaning being large-beaked and little-beaked birds don't reproduce. If you've got some differentiation there where individuals then, hone in on or the two food sources, soft seeds or hard seeds, then over time, the individuals with larger beaks that focus on hard seeds can lose that ability to have offspring with small beaks. So this could be the foundation for starting to split these two species. You can think of it as individuals, like back to the pocket mice example. If the dark mice that live on lava still carry the genes for light-colored mice, and so their offspring are light-colored, they're likely to get eaten. They're not able to run all the way down to the softer or the lighter substrate areas. So that's one way that we can start to have divergence. So natural selection can result in populations in which all individuals have the favored allele. Indian geese have evolved a type of hemoglobin for very high affinity, which has a very high affinity for oxygen, so they live at high altitudes, and so having hemoglobin that can absorb oxygen more efficiently is useful. This allele frequency for this trait is at 100%, so it's reached fixation, which meaning all of the Indian geese at high elevations or altitudes have this allele. So now all of their offspring would also have that same allele for the hemoglobin with high affinity for oxygen. Okay, we'll end this section here and then post a few more.